In the unforgiving Appalachian Mountains, one man's ingenuity turned the harshest winter conditions into his greatest survival advantage. His cabin, designed with a raised roof gap, became a fortress against the cold, with temperatures soaring 33 degrees higher inside. But it wasn't just the elements he had to contend with, it was the knowledge he'd gained from his survival in a place where every day felt like a battle for life. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this ignite your curiosity, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because the next chapter of this mountain man's life is even more extraordinary. The chill of winter had come early in the Appalachian Mountains that year, and the rugged, weathered cabin stood against the biting wind like a stubborn sentinel. Within its walls, a lone man toiled away, his movements deliberate and measured. His name was Isaac Carver, a mountaineer whose life had been shaped by the harsh landscape around him. He had learned to fight the mountain, but it had never been a fair match, until now. Isaac was a man of thick, calloused hands, with a weathered face framed by a dark, bushy beard and deep-set eyes that had seen more than his fair share of hardship. He wore a fur-lined coat, heavy with the scent of pine and the weight of necessity, and a thick pair of boots that seemed to have been forged in the fires of the wilderness itself. His clothes were practical, built to withstand the freezing winds that cut through even the thickest fabrics. Beneath his coat, a woolen shirt clung to his broad chest, and thick trousers tucked into the boots completed his ensemble. As the snowstorm outside raged, Isaac stood on the edge of the cabin's roof, peering into the cold expanse of white that stretched endlessly beyond. His mind was focused, sharp with a singular purpose. The raised roof gap he had built, a simple yet revolutionary feature, was the result of months of trial and error. In the beginning, it had been a mere idea born out of frustration and cold, but over the course of his isolated winters, it had evolved into something far more significant. The gap, allowing heated air to circulate naturally through the cabin, had made the difference between life and death in these brutal conditions. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending flickers of warmth into the room. The cabin, once a place of bitter chill and ever-present frost, now offered a refuge. Isaac ran his hand over the rough-hewn logs that made up the walls, the craftsmanship reflecting both a learned skill and the practicality that was the hallmark of a mountain man's life. Despite the warmth inside, the cabin was still too cold to be considered truly comfortable. But this year, thanks to his invention, the difference was palpable. The air, swirling above the raised roof gap, maintained a steady temperature that was significantly warmer than the outside world. Isaac's hands were not idle, though. His mind raced ahead, knowing that the gap was not the final solution, but a step towards something greater. He had already begun considering the next winter, the next test for his creation. The storms outside intensified as night fell. Isaac made his way to the corner of the cabin, where the half-built shelves still awaited completion. His plans for the cabin were far from finished. This was just the beginning. The wind howled once more, but Isaac Carver, the Appalachian mountaineer, felt a quiet satisfaction. For the first time in years, he had found a way to push back against the relentless mountain cold, a victory that felt as tangible as the logs beneath his hands. Isaac had not always been a mountain man. His journey into the wilds of Appalachia had begun years before, when he had left his small village in the valley in search of a life he could truly call his own. His father had been a farmer, struggling to keep the land that had been passed down through generations. But the earth had become unforgiving. With each season, the crops had failed, and the rain had not come when it was needed. In the end, it had been Isaac who made the decision to leave, to forge a new path on his own terms. He packed what little he could carry, a rifle slung over his shoulder, a small satchel of supplies, and a few keepsakes from his childhood. The rest he had to learn along the way. The days that followed had been filled with trials, harsh winters, predators that lurked in the shadows, and a solitude that felt both peaceful and suffocating. Yet Isaac had learned quickly, his keen mind absorbing the ways of the wilderness like a sponge. His first winter alone in the mountains had been brutal. The cabin he had built, though sturdy, was not enough to protect him from the bitter cold. He had learned to survive, but barely. His fingers had ached from the cold, and his toes had burned with frostbite as he trudged through the snow to collect firewood. His meals had been sparse, his company limited to the occasional passing animal or the far-off howl of a wolf. Yet through it all, Isaac had refused to give in. He had spent the winter teaching himself how to adapt, how to create better shelters, how to master his environment. It was during one of these harsh winters that Isaac had his first true breakthrough. The wind had whipped through his cabin, howling like a beast intent on tearing the roof off. The fire in the hearth struggled to keep pace with the cold, and the cabin felt like a tomb more than a home. It was then that Isaac had noticed something. The air inside the cabin was stagnant, and despite the fire, it never seemed to warm the room enough. He knew something had to change. For days he experimented, trying to figure out how to solve the problem. He was no carpenter by trade, but his father had taught him the basics. He had a good eye for structural integrity, and over the course of several winters, he had learned to build cabins that were strong enough to endure the brutal weather. But this time, the solution was not in the structure itself. The problem was the air. That's when Isaac had the idea for the raised roof gap. By raising the roof slightly, he could create a natural convection that would allow the warm air to circulate through the cabin more effectively. The heat from the fire would rise and spread throughout the space, creating a more consistent temperature. It wasn't an easy solution, and the cabin's roof had to be modified carefully to maintain the integrity of the structure. But after much labor, Isaac finally had the breakthrough he was waiting for. The first night after he completed the gap, Isaac sat back in his chair, a steaming cup of tea in hand, and watched as the temperature inside his cabin remained comfortable, even as the wind howled outside. It was a small victory, but to Isaac, it felt monumental. This was more than just a solution to the cold. It was proof that he could solve the problems that the mountain threw at him, and with that, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the life he had chosen, and he would not be beaten by the wilderness. Winter's grasp tightened on the Appalachian Mountains as Isaac prepared for another season. The storms that had plagued him in previous years were now a familiar adversary, and the raised roof gap he had designed into his cabin was ready for its first real test. Despite the promising results he'd seen so far, Isaac wasn't naive. The mountain's cold could find a way to seep into even the best-built structures. It was his obsession now, how to ensure that his cabin could withstand the worst that winter had to offer. In preparation for the season ahead, Isaac fortified his supplies, gathering firewood, dried meats, and a stockpile of herbs for teas that could stave off the chills. The cabin, now sturdier than before, sat against the backdrop of the mountains, its raised roof gap and modified roofline standing out as a testament to his ingenuity. The gap, positioned just below the roofline, was built to allow the hot air from the hearth to circulate freely, traveling upward and warming the lofted space above. Isaac knew that the cold would come again, and when it did, it would test the worth of his creation. The first snowstorm of the year arrived early, howling through the forest with a fury that made the trees bend low. By the time the first flakes fell, Isaac was already inside the cabin, preparing the hearth for the long hours ahead. The wind's cry was sharp and bitter, but within his cabin, Isaac felt a subtle shift. The warmth was immediate. It spread more evenly this time, as though the cabin itself had become a living thing, breathing and responding to the air's demands. The fire crackled, snapping and popping as the flames licked at the dried wood. Isaac sat back, letting the heat wash over him, watching the way the air moved around the cabin. The raised roof gap, though seemingly simple, was doing exactly what it was meant to do. The warm air moved upwards, filling the space above the fire, while the cooler air sank, creating a natural flow that kept the cabin warm without the constant need for stoking the fire. The true test came when the storm grew worse. The winds rattled the windows, and the snow began to pile against the door, sealing Isaac inside. It was in the dead of night that Isaac heard the crunch of snow under heavy feet. His heart skipped a beat. It was the unmistakable sound of something large moving in the snow outside. He grabbed his rifle and crept toward the door, peering through the small, reinforced window. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadowy white wilderness. A bear, perhaps the very one that had once tested his old cabin, had come close, drawn by the scent of food or the warmth escaping from his fire. Isaac's heart raced, but he didn't rush. He knew what he had to do. Quietly he lifted the rifle, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out through the night, but the bear did not flinch. Instead, it turned, its massive form retreating into the swirling snow. Isaac exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and satisfaction. The creature had not been able to find a way inside. The cabin had held. Isaac sat down by the fire, his breath steadying. The storm raged outside, but inside his cabin was a refuge. The raised roof gap, simple in design, yet transformative in its effect, had passed its first true test. Isaac allowed himself a rare moment of rest. The wilderness had shown him its wrath, but his cabin, now stronger than ever, had proven its worth. Winter, as it often did in the Appalachian Mountains, wore on relentlessly. The snow continued to pile high against Isaac's cabin, burying the world in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. But Isaac was no longer as concerned with the physical cold as he had been before. It was the internal struggle that now consumed him, the struggle between his desires for peace and the pull of his obsessive need to perfect the cabin he had created. As the months passed, Isaac found himself spending more and more time refining the details of his creation. The raised roof gap, though working better than he had anticipated, was only the beginning. Isaac's mind was always calculating, always looking for ways to improve. He had already made plans to insulate the walls better, to seal up the windows more tightly, and to introduce a more advanced form of heat circulation. For Isaac, there was always something to be improved upon. Nothing was ever quite perfect. The toll of his obsession was starting to take shape in subtle ways. He had barely spoken to anyone since the previous winter, and the isolation of the mountain life, though initially welcome, had begun to weigh heavily on him. His visits to the nearby trading post had become fewer, and the few neighbors he had once shared stories and drinks with had slowly faded from his life. Isaac's focus was consumed entirely by the cabin. He no longer had time for distractions. One evening, as Isaac worked by the hearth, a soft knock came at the door. Surprised, he rose to answer it, unsure of who would be out in the snowstorm. When he opened the door, he found a young man standing on the threshold, his clothes soaked and his face pale from the cold. Isaac recognized him immediately as Thomas Miller, a fellow mountaineer who lived a few miles down the valley. "Isaac," Thomas said, his voice shivering as he stepped inside. "I need your help." Isaac raised an eyebrow, closing the door behind him. "What happened?" "Bear attack," Thomas replied, his teeth chattering. "I barely got away. My cabin, it's gone, destroyed." Isaac nodded grimly. He had heard similar stories in the past, stories of grizzlies tearing apart the crude cabins of men who had failed to take the proper precautions. But what struck Isaac was the way Thomas had phrased it. His cabin wasn't just damaged, it was destroyed. Thomas, seeing Isaac's understanding, continued, "I came to ask you, what's the secret to your cabin? How did you make it so strong? I've seen bears tear apart cabins before, but yours, it holds." Isaac paused, the firelight flickering across his face. He had never really thought about it in such simple terms. His cabin was strong, yes, but it had come at a cost. The obsession that had driven him to perfect every detail of its design had also pushed him away from the very community he had once been a part of. "You're welcome to come back with me," Isaac said finally. "I'll show you how it's done." As Thomas followed Isaac toward the cabin, Isaac couldn't help but reflect on the price he had paid for his innovation. The world outside his cabin had passed him by, but in the depths of his heart, he knew that his obsession had led him to something greater than mere survival. It had brought him to a place of mastery, a place where the mountain could no longer defeat him. Still, Isaac wondered if the cost of that mastery was worth the price of isolation. Spring in the Appalachian Mountains was a time of fragile hope. The snow that had piled so high throughout the winter slowly began to melt, revealing the rugged, unyielding terrain that had been hidden under the ice and snow for months. Isaac Carver stood on the porch of his cabin, his breath fogging in the morning air, his eyes scanning the horizon. The winter had been harsh, but his cabin had survived. It had passed its test, and now the seasons were changing, ushering in a time of renewal. Despite the promise of spring, Isaac's mind remained heavy. His thoughts were still consumed by the recent visit from Thomas Miller. The young mountaineer had come seeking help after his own cabin was destroyed by a bear attack, and Isaac had shared the methods he used to reinforce his own cabin. He had given Thomas the tools to rebuild, but as the weeks passed, Isaac found himself wondering whether his isolated life was beginning to take a toll on him. Thomas's visit had reminded Isaac of the small but significant connection he had with the outside world. It had been a long time since he'd shared anything personal with someone. For years, his thoughts had been consumed by the need to survive, to perfect his cabin, to conquer the mountain's relentless cold. But now, with the bear attacks behind him and the immediate threat of winter over, Isaac began to realize that there was something he had been neglecting, a part of him that had withered in isolation. He walked down the steps of the porch and made his way to the small clearing where he had spent many evenings gathering firewood and working on his designs. The trees around him were beginning to bud, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Spring had arrived in full force, yet Isaac's mind lingered on the distant mountainside. He thought about his family, the life he had left behind. He had no immediate family to return to, but he had once had a community, a place where he could share stories, where he could find solace in others. It was a distant memory now, one that seemed to fade more with each passing season. The mountain had claimed him, body and soul, and though he had found a kind of peace in his work, it was becoming clear that he could no longer live solely for survival. Isaac paused in the clearing, his eyes catching the faintest glimpse of something moving in the distance. A group of deer, cautiously making their way through the brush, their ears flicking at every sound. He smiled faintly, the sight reminding him of the balance of life in the wilderness, a balance he had once been part of. He spent the rest of the day working around the cabin, adding final touches to the reinforced door and roof. The raised roof gap had proven to be his greatest achievement, but it was the small refinements that brought him the most satisfaction now. Each stroke of his hammer, each careful placement of a log, felt like a reaffirmation of his connection to the land. Even as he worked, Isaac realized that his obsession with perfection had perhaps been a form of escape from the pain, from the past, from the loss. As night began to fall and the first stars appeared in the sky, Isaac stood once more on the porch of his cabin. The air had a slight warmth to it now, a gentle reminder that the harshness of winter had passed. The cabin, still strong and resilient, stood as a testament to his determination. But in the quiet of the evening, Isaac understood that the work was not yet finished. The mountain would always test him, but perhaps now, after all the struggles, there was room for something more than survival, something that could restore the humanity he had lost in the pursuit of perfection. The coming of spring had not only brought new life to the land, but had also brought new challenges to Isaac. As the days lengthened and the warmth of the sun began to thaw the mountains, he found himself facing a different kind of struggle, one that had little to do with the cold or the dangers of the wilderness, and everything to do with the choices he had made. Isaac had always believed that isolation was a necessary part of survival. The mountain had taught him that relying on others was a dangerous gamble, and over the years he had built his life around the concept of self-sufficiency. But now, as he stood in the middle of the clearing, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretched before him, he began to question that belief. It was late in the afternoon when he first heard the sound, the unmistakable thrum of hooves against the earth. Isaac froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that hung across his back. His heart quickened as the sound grew louder, but it wasn't the sound of a wild animal. It was the sound of men, and a group of them at that. A voice called out in the distance, followed by another. Isaac's grip tightened on his rifle as he listened. There was no mistaking it. Someone was coming. His cabin had been hidden away, protected by the mountains, but the tracks in the snow had betrayed him. The hunters, travelers, or perhaps other settlers, Isaac didn't know, were making their way up the valley. The realization hit Isaac like a stone. His isolation, his carefully crafted solitude, had come to an end. He had spent years building this life, and now it seemed to be slipping away. The idea of sharing his space, his work, and his achievements with others felt like a violation of everything he had worked for. The cabin, a place of refuge and security, now felt like a prison. As the voices drew closer, Isaac moved quickly to secure his cabin. He bolted the door and slid the heavy lock into place. The raised roof gap that had once seemed like the perfect solution now felt inadequate. What would these strangers think of him, this man who had created something entirely new, in a place that had known only tradition? Would they mock him for his obsession, or would they, too, see the value in his work? The men arrived at his cabin just as the sun began to set, casting a pale orange light over the mountains. Isaac stood in the shadows, watching through the small crack in the window, his heart racing. They approached cautiously, not sure what to expect from a cabin so far off the beaten path. They spoke quietly amongst themselves, glancing up at the sturdy structure before turning to face the door. Isaac's thoughts raced, but he didn't move. The familiar feeling of isolation clung to him, and he wasn't ready to face the truth he had been avoiding. For years he had believed that survival came only through self-reliance. But now, as the men waited outside, Isaac realized that perhaps survival also meant accepting the help of others, learning to share his burdens and his triumphs. The realization was bitter. It tasted like defeat, yet at the same time it was liberating. The mountain had not only taught him how to survive, it had taught him the importance of connection, and as Isaac took a deep breath, he knew that the time had come to face the truth. He could no longer live solely for himself. The men outside knocked gently on the door, and Isaac, with a mixture of fear and resolve, stepped forward to answer. Isaac hesitated at the door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden beam that locked it in place. The men outside waited patiently, their voices low and respectful. The weight of their presence pressed down on him, but his mind was in turmoil. Years of solitude had made him wary of outsiders. The last thing he wanted was to invite the world back into his life, yet something in him knew this moment was inevitable. The world, after all, could not be avoided forever. With a reluctant sigh, Isaac slid the bolt back and opened the door. The evening light spilled in, revealing the figures standing before him. There were 3 men, rough-hewn and weathered by the wilderness, much like himself. They wore heavy coats, their faces scarred from years of exposure to the elements. One had a rifle slung over his shoulder, another carried a pack laden with supplies. The third, a lean man with a thick black beard, stepped forward and spoke. "We were traveling through and noticed your cabin from the ridge. We're in need of shelter for the night. The storms come up fast, and we'd be grateful for your hospitality." Isaac studied them carefully, his instincts sharp. They had the look of men who knew the mountains, but there was something in their eyes that spoke of desperation. They weren't just travelers seeking warmth. They were men with their own stories, their own burdens, much like Isaac. For a long moment Isaac said nothing. The silence stretched thick with tension, until the man with the beard spoke again. "We won't be a bother. Just need a place to sleep out the storm, and we'll be gone by morning." Isaac glanced over his shoulder at the cabin. The fire was still crackling in the hearth, the warmth from the raised roof gap filling the room with a gentle, inviting heat. It felt like his sanctuary, the product of years of hard work and solitude. To let strangers into that space now felt like a violation of everything he had built. Yet he could see the sincerity in their eyes, and his heart softened. "All right," Isaac muttered. "Come in, but keep to yourselves." The men entered cautiously, shedding their snow-dusted coats as they stepped into the warmth of the cabin. Isaac gestured to the fire, and they took their places in front of it, grateful for the heat. The cabin, though simple, had an undeniable comfort to it. The stone fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Isaac watched them from the corner, still uncertain, but unwilling, to turn them away. As the men settled, the sounds of the storm grew louder outside. The wind howled and snow battered against the walls. Inside, the cabin felt like an island of warmth, a small respite from the chaos of the wilderness. For a moment, Isaac allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. The storm would pass, and so would these visitors. But in the meantime, Isaac couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling deep within him, that in opening the door to these men, he had opened the door to something more dangerous than a storm. The hours passed slowly, the storm outside growing fiercer as night fell. Isaac had returned to his work by the fire, his hands moving absently over the tools he had left on the small wooden table. He couldn't help but glance up every now and then at his guests. The three men sat in front of the hearth, speaking in low tones. They were not loud nor disruptive, but their presence made the cabin feel smaller somehow. Isaac could feel the space between them stretching, an unspoken distance that neither side dared to close. The lean man with the black beard, who had introduced himself as Jacob, turned toward Isaac after a while. "We've heard stories about your cabin," he said quietly, his voice measured. "Some of the others say you built it to withstand the storms, the bears, the cold." Isaac raised an eyebrow, not sure what to make of the comment. "That's right," he replied shortly, not wanting to divulge too much. His cabin was his life's work, and he had no intention of discussing it with strangers, much less explaining every detail of the design. Jacob, sensing Isaac's reluctance, nodded, but didn't press the issue. Instead, he shifted his focus to the fire. "We've seen our share of rough winters, built our own cabins, fought off bears, hunted for food when we had to. But there's something different about yours, the way it keeps the heat, the way it holds up against the wind." Isaac felt a flicker of pride stir within him, but he quickly stifled it. He hadn't built the cabin to impress anyone. It had been built to survive. Still, the acknowledgement from these men made the isolation he'd embraced seem less complete. They had noticed, seen the quiet brilliance in the simple design. "I learned by trial and error," Isaac replied, his voice steady but guarded. "The mountain teaches you if you're patient enough." Jacob's eyes met Isaac's, an understanding passing between them. Isaac could tell that the man recognized the struggle that lay beneath his words, the survival instinct, the need to adapt, to create something that would outlast the harshest trials. "The mountain has a way of shaping you, doesn't it?" Jacob said, his tone softer now. "Makes a man realize what he's truly capable of." Isaac didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the fire, the crackling of the logs filling the silence. Between them, the storm howled outside, but inside the cabin was warm, peaceful even. But peace was fleeting. The longer the men stayed, the more Isaac's sense of unease grew. This moment, this brief respite from the cold, was a luxury he hadn't allowed himself in years. As he sat back in his chair, Isaac realized the truth he had been avoiding. His obsession with survival, with isolation, had kept him from experiencing the very thing that made survival worth it: connection. He had spent so many years building a life of self-reliance that he had forgotten the warmth that came from sharing it with others. The price of his invention had not been measured in the hours spent constructing the cabin or the countless winters he had endured. It had been measured in the distance he had put between himself and those who might have been able to help him along the way. Tonight, in the quiet of the cabin, Isaac understood that survival was not just about building something that could endure the storm, it was about finding a way to weather it together. But whether he was ready to embrace that truth, he wasn't sure yet. As Jacob and the others settled in for the night, Isaac found himself looking out the small window, the dark wilderness beyond seeming both welcoming and uninviting at once. The storm would pass, and so would these men. But for Isaac, the question remained: how long would it take for him to truly open the door to the world beyond the mountains? Morning arrived with a thin light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The storm had passed, leaving the world quiet and still. Isaac stood by the fire, his mind restless. The men had slept soundly through the night, leaving Isaac to his thoughts. In the calm after the storm, the weight of the decision he had been avoiding settled over him. As he worked at the hearth, the men packed their things, preparing to leave. Jacob approached him, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding passing between them. Isaac could see the gratitude in their eyes, but it was more than that. It was an unspoken bond, a recognition of something deeper. "You've got a good place here, Isaac," Jacob said as he adjusted his pack. "If you ever need company or help, don't hesitate." Isaac nodded, the words settling within him. For the first time, he realized that survival wasn't just about shelter or heat. It was about the people who stood beside you, even if only for a moment. He had always believed that isolation was his only path, but now he knew better. The men left as the sun climbed higher, their figures fading into the distance. Isaac watched them go, the quiet of the mountain settling around him once more. With the departure of his guests, the weight in his chest lifted slightly. The cabin felt, in a way, emptier now, but something had changed within him. The work on the cabin was never truly finished. He knew that. There were always improvements to be made, adjustments, to be considered. But now Isaac understood that his true legacy wasn't in the logs he had shaped or the roof gap he had created. It was in the connections he made, fleeting though they may be. Isaac returned to his work, but this time he moved more slowly, allowing the quiet moments to linger. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it, not alone, but as part of something greater. The mountain was no longer just his challenge, it was his home.